The Chuckwagon Kit had a standard list: bandages, splints, a bottle of turpentine for wounds, a supply of quinine for fever, and laudanum, always laudanum. On a cattle drive that might take 3 months across 1,000 miles of open country between Texas and Kansas, the laudanum bottle was one of the most important things in the wagon. Because the men on that drive were going to get hurt, and they were going to get sick. And there was no doctor within 100 miles in any direction. And laudanum was the closest thing to medical care that the trail could carry. This was the practical standard of healthcare for most working people in the American West. In the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. Not the surgeon in the clean office, not the hospital, not the physician with the framed degree on the wall. The trail kit, the general store shelf, the traveling medicine wagon that rolled through every few months bottles of preparation that claimed to cure everything from rheumatism to cholera. The bottle of laudanum that the cowboy had been taking every day for 6 weeks for a bad shoulder, and that he was starting to need more of than he used to. The myth about frontier healthcare is that there was not any. The image most people carry is pure improvisation, a broken arm set by whoever happened to be nearby, a bullet dug out with a knife, a fever sweated out in a bedroll while the herd moved on without the sick man. That improvisation was real, but focusing only on the absence of medicine misses the more complicated and more disturbing truth. The frontier had medicine. It had trained doctors in pharmacy preparations and patent compounds, and a growing industry of healthcare products moving west on every wagon train and supply route. The problem was not the absence of medicine. The problem was the medicine. Working person's healthcare system on the frontier operated in layers, and each layer had something to offer and something to take. Understanding how that system actually functioned means starting where most frontier people started, which was not in a doctor's office, but at the chuck wagon, at the general store counter, at the bottom of whatever was available. Laudanum was the foundation of frontier pain management for a generation of working people in the American West. Tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. It was legal throughout this period, sold without restriction, and recommended by physicians as a safe and effective preparation for a wide range of conditions. Pain after injury? Yes, but also anxiety, sleeplessness, digestive complaints, menstrual pain, chronic cough, and the general category of problems that doctors in this era described as constitutional weakness or nervous trouble. A physician who prescribed it was not being careless. He was prescribing one of the most effective pain relief preparations available to him, within a pharmacological understanding that did not yet include any clinical framework for opioid dependency as a distinct medical condition. The cowboy who started taking it for a bruised shoulder 6 weeks into the drive was not doing anything his employer considered unusual. The laudanum was in the kit for exactly this kind of situation. It worked. The pain became manageable. He kept working. The drive kept moving. This is the moment where the system appears to be functioning correctly. And in the short term it is. Physical dependence on opioids develops with regular use over time. The timeline varies by person and dosage, but several weeks of daily use on a painful injury was enough for many people to cross a line they did not know existed and could not have named if they tried. The signs of that crossing: a need for more of the preparation to achieve the same relief, physical discomfort when a dose was delayed, a growing urgency about keeping the bottle full. These signs did not map onto any medical category that the frontier understood. They looked like the original injury getting worse. They looked like trail sickness, or exhaustion, or weakness of character. The word addiction, in anything like its modern meaning, did not exist as a useful clinical concept in the medicine of the 1870s. When the laudanum ran out, which happened when the supply was miscalculated, or when a man had been taking more than the standard dose for longer than expected, the withdrawal that followed looked indistinguishable from illness to everyone involved. Sweating, severe abdominal cramps, agitation, sleeplessness, a desperate need for more of the preparation. The trail boss had no framework for interpreting this correctly. The cowboy himself probably did not understand what was happening to his body. Other men on the drive had seen similar symptoms from bad water or bad food. Everyone managed it the way they managed everything else on the trail, which was to push through it and wait for it to stop. And this time that approach did not work because the source of the suffering was not trail conditions. It was the treatment they had trusted. The patent medicine industry had built itself on top of this gap, and it had done so with considerable commercial sophistication. Every frontier community of any size was visited periodically by traveling salesmen, carrying preparations that claimed to address most of the conditions that could make a person feel bad in the West. The traveling medicine show was partly theater. A salesman who could draw a crowd, build a compelling story of miraculous recoveries, and demonstrate the preparation's effects on willing audience members was more effective than one who simply parked a wagon and waited. The performances were real performances, with oratory, and sometimes music and testimonials from people who had used the product. The audience knew they were being sold to. They came anyway because they had genuine health problems, and the preparations being sold were sometimes as effective as anything else available. The contents of these preparations were almost never fully disclosed on the label. Inside might be alcohol, which accounted for a significant part of the perceived effect. There might be opium derivatives, morphine, or after the 1880s, cocaine. There might be plant extracts of varying and sometimes genuine pharmacological value. Willow bark had been used by many indigenous communities across the continent for pain management and contained a compound related to what we now call aspirin. Some patent medicine preparations included it. Others contained belladonna, which is atropine, a drug with real and powerful effects on the nervous system. The labels name neither the mechanism nor the ingredients. They named the outcomes they promised. The economics of frontier healthcare added a layer of pressure that shaped every decision a working person made about their own condition. A cowboy earning $25 a month had very little room for medical expenses. A doctor's visit in a Kansas cow town in the 1870s might cost $2 or $3 for a consultation, and more for any procedure. A course of calomel treatment and follow-up visits could run to $10 or $15. A bottle of patent medicine from the traveling wagon cost 50 cents. When those are the options available to a man who has just finished 3 months on the trail and has 2 months of wages in his pocket, the economics are not difficult to follow. This was not stupidity, and it was not desperation. It was rational behavior in a market where the expensive option was not demonstrably better than the cheap one, and where the expensive option came with additional discomforts the cheap one avoided. The patent medicines industry understood this and priced its products accordingly. It marketed directly to the people whom the medical profession was pricing out of formal care. And it offered them something real, which was the sensation of feeling better, even when the mechanism behind that sensation was one they would not have chosen if they had known what it was. People who purchased these preparations were not making irrational decisions. They felt bad. The preparation made them feel better. That was real, and for a significant number of purchasers, it was a genuine improvement over the alternatives, which were expensive, involved unpleasant procedures, and were applied by practitioners whose methods were not as reliable as their confidence suggested. The market for patent medicine was large and sustained precisely because it filled a real gap. The children's preparations were the part of this industry that looks most troubling from the current distance. Soothing syrups marketed for infants and young children were among the most widely sold patent medicine products, and a significant number of them contained morphine or heroin derivatives. They worked. They sedated the children who received them and produced the quiet that exhausted frontier parents were genuinely desperate for. Children who received regular doses became tolerant of the preparation and difficult when it was withheld, which looked to parents like the original problem returning, rather than like what it actually was. The medicine was legal. The doctor sometimes recommended it. It appeared to help. The official medical system, the one with the degrees and the trained practitioners, was not always offering something clearly superior to the patent medicine wagon. And this is the part of frontier medical history that later accounts tend to obscure. After germ theory and antiseptic technique and modern pharmacology transformed medicine across the last decades of the 19th century and into the 20th, it became easy to draw a clear line between legitimate medical practice and patent medicine fraud. That line was not clear in the 1870s. A doctor applying calomel treatment for a fever was applying mercurous chloride, a mercury compound, in the sincere belief that it would help. A patent medicine bottle claiming to treat the same fever with a preparation that contained alcohol and plant extracts was often safer. Calomel had been a standard prescription drug in American medicine for decades by this point. It was given for fevers, for infections, for digestive complaints, for liver trouble, and for a range of conditions that a doctor described as requiring the body to purge and rebalance. The salivation it caused was read as evidence that the drug was doing its job. Patients on extended courses of calomel developed darkened teeth and receding gums. These were sometimes noted in records and sometimes attributed to the underlying disease rather than to the treatment. What they were was mercury poisoning, presenting its characteristic signs. The framework of disease that made calomel seem like good medicine was built on the idea that illness was internal imbalance, and that health was restored by purging and shocking the body back toward equilibrium. Within that framework, the side effects of calomel looked therapeutic. The framework was wrong about the mechanism of disease, and that wrongness was applied with complete professional commitment by trained men who had genuine clinical experience suggesting their methods worked. Surgery without germ theory produced the same pattern. A man who came into a frontier surgeon's office with a gunshot wound or a serious fracture was going to receive treatment from a professional applying the accepted standard of care for the 1870s. That standard included probing wounds with instruments and fingers that had not been sterilized, because sterilization as a concept was either unknown or contested. Joseph Lister's work on antiseptic technique had begun reaching American medical education by the late 1870s. But adoption was uneven, and the older generation of practitioners was often skeptical of a theory that seemed to ask them to accept invisible organisms as the source of problems they had always attributed to the wound itself or to the patient's constitution. Amputation was the frontier surgeon's primary response to serious limb injuries. It was not an unreasonable choice within the logic available. A shattered bone after a gunshot or a bad fall carried genuine risk. Removing the damaged limb removed the site of the problem. The operation itself was measured partly by how fast it could be completed, because speed was mercy when anesthesia was uncertain. A surgeon who could complete the procedure in 60 seconds was considered skilled. What speed prevented was any careful preparation of the operating environment, which would not have been considered necessary anyway. You are a cowboy who has come off a cattle drive with a wound to your arm that has not healed right across 3 months of trail life. You ride into a Kansas cow town at the end of the drive. You find the doctor. He is professional and thorough. He examines the wound carefully. He probes it to assess the tissue damage. He prescribes calomel for the fever that has been building since the wound started smelling bad. He discusses with you whether the arm might need to come off. He is a serious man doing serious work within the framework he was trained to apply. The fever you have is a sign that infection is already established. The probing of the wound will introduce more of it. The calomel will add mercury poisoning to the inflammation. The amputation, if it happens, will be performed in a room that has seen other patients today. You have 3 pay envelopes in your pocket from the drive. The medicine and the doctor's fee will take most of what you have. What you will be left with is unclear. Dentistry was in some ways the most widely shared medical problem on the frontier. Because it touched the largest number of people with the greatest consistency, trained dentists existed in larger towns and cities and were rare or absent in smaller frontier communities. Tooth extraction was performed by barbers, by general practitioners who had received minimal dental training as part of their medical education, or by the person in the most painmaking do with whatever was at hand. The instrument was a device that functioned as pliers. The procedure was performed without effective anesthesia. A dental abscess is an infection at the root of a tooth, and it is not a minor inconvenience if it is not treated. The infection can spread through the jaw, through the soft tissue of the throat, into the spaces around the windpipe, and into the bloodstream. The spread of a dental infection into systemic blood poisoning was a genuine cause of death on the frontier, and it was particularly hard to document because the timeline was long. A man who died of fever 3 weeks after a toothache began might not have those 2 events connected in any record that survived him. Cattle drive journals and ranch records from this period mentioned dental pain with enough regularity to suggest it was a constant background presence in frontier working life. A cowboy 3 months into a drive from Texas to Kansas had no access to any dental care. If a tooth began to abscess, his options were laudanum for the pain, which managed it partially and temporarily, or having someone on the drive attempt a field extraction. An attempted extraction with trail pliers and trail whiskey on a man who was not properly sedated, in conditions that were not sterile, addressed the structural problem in the tooth while introducing new problems of its own. The open wound in the mouth was exposed to everything the trail carried. The case that makes the larger argument most clearly is not from a cattle drive or a mining camp. It is from Washington in the summer of 1881, where President James Garfield was shot by Charles Guiteau on the 2nd of July. The bullet entered Garfield's back and lodged somewhere in his torso. Guiteau's shot had missed the major blood vessels and the spinal cord. Garfield was conscious and coherent after the shooting. Medical review of the wound's trajectory, conducted by physicians who examined the historical evidence decades later, strongly suggests that the injury as inflicted was survivable with adequate care. The care Garfield received over the following 11 weeks was provided by some of the most prominent physicians in the country. The principal intervention was repeated manual probing of the wound to locate the bullet, conducted with fingers and instruments that were not sterilized. This was not negligence within the framework these physicians operated in. Germ theory was contested ground in American medicines in 1881, and the doctors asked treating Garfield were largely trained before Lister's antiseptic principles had established themselves in American medical education. The probing was done in the wrong direction, based on an incorrect assessment of the bullet's path, and it opened a false channel through healthy tissue. Alexander Graham Bell arrived with a metal detection device he had built to locate the bullet. The device returned false readings because Garfield was lying on a metal spring mattress that no one thought to move. The bullet was never accurately located. Garfield died on the 19th of September. The autopsy found massive infection throughout his torso and a wound that had grown from a small entry point to a large infected cavity. The bullet had barely moved from where it came to rest on the day of the shooting. It had been located nowhere near where the medical team was probing. The cause of death was blood poisoning. The infection had been introduced by the treatment. Guiteau shot Garfield. The doctors killed him. The physicians who performed the autopsy said as much. Medical historians who have examined the case since have reached the same conclusion. The bullet was not the problem. The problem was 11 weeks of thorough, well-intentioned, professionally executed medical care applied by some of the most respected physicians in the country, according to the accepted standard of their era. And that standard was built on assumptions about infection that were in the process of being overturned at that exact moment in medical history. Guiteau was hanged for murder. The physicians continued practicing. The Garfield case is not a story about incompetent doctors. It is a story about what happens when a coherent but wrong system is applied with maximum skill and full professional commitment by its most capable practitioners. They did not fail their training. Their training failed them. And it failed Garfield, and it failed every patient across the frontier who came to a doctor expecting the science behind the degree and received instead the confident application of the wrong theory. Back on the trail, 6 weeks before the end of the drive, the cowboy is sitting with his back against a wagon wheel as the sun goes down and the herd settles for the night. His shoulder still hurts from the fall he took in week 3. He reaches into the Chuckwagon Kit and measures a dose of laudanum into his hand and swallows it. The pain backs off within half an hour. He has been doing this every day for 3 weeks. The dose he takes now is a little larger than the dose he started with, though he has not thought about that specifically. He just knows that the earlier amount stopped being enough. The bottle is more than half gone. The drive has 6 more weeks to run. He does not know what is building in his body. The cook who packed the kit did not know either. The man who sold the outfitter the laudanum knew it contained opium, but did not consider that information his customers' concern. The doctor the cowboy will see in Abilene when the drive is done will look at the shoulder, probe the scar tissue, and prescribe more of the same preparation, because it is the indicated treatment for persistent pain in the medicine of 1875. And the cowboy is going to need it. The system is working exactly as designed. That is the problem with it. It is not chaos, not ignorance, not the absence of care. It is a complete and functioning system applying itself with full confidence to human bodies and doing harm at every step in ways that the system itself cannot see and was not built to recognize. The frontier was not a place without medicine. It was a place where medicine had not yet learned what it was doing wrong.